Empire. Player tracking is expanding.
Once you start working with a league or a specific sport, you definitely want to customize those insights to help them optimize performance and reduce injury, and ideally prolong their ability to compete in high level.
That's Will Lopes, CEO of Catapult, who has a modern way to learn more about some of the best lacrosse players in the world. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein. Will Lopes joined us some months back to discuss Catapult's capabilities and initiatives. Today, he and Mike Giunta, the head physical therapist of the Premiere Lacrosse League, are here to talk about their new partnership as the world of training continues to modernize. Our guest this week, one is a repeat guest, Will Lopes, the CEO of Catapult, and Mike Giunta, who's the head physical therapist of the Premiere Lacrosse League. As the two sides have teamed up to track and optimize athlete performance in one of the best lacrosse leagues in the world. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Hey, Will, let me start with you. How did the relationship start with the PLL?
Yeah, it's an interesting story, actually. I think as the PLL has expanded and really started to become or rather is an elite league at this point, they started to attract a lot of the players who had been working with Catapult in the past, whether they were working with us at NCAA D1 teams or even in the NFL, for example. And they were used to having technology that was the leading edge in terms of performance and understanding how their performance was impacting their training and vice versa. And so they actually, it was a player-led conversation that I think kind of kicked us off, which, to us is I think indicative of what we know about our products and how it works with, teams and athletes today. So it really helped on that front. And then, I think what has been great to just discover over the last few months is that, the challenges that the PLL has is very similar. As a matter of fact, it's exact challenges that other, sort of elite leagues have as well. It's how do you manage, the health and the wellness of your player? How do you create training regimens that keeps them at peak performance? How do you keep your best players on the field? And we know we have, deep expertise in doing that with, the EPLs and the NFLs of the world. And the PLL, as it's become, really the elite league in lacrosse, is looking to do the same.
Mike, do you want to confirm that the players came knocking on your door and said, we need this to move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that we've been trying to develop over the last couple of years. And there's always been that getting what's best for the athlete challenge in a sense where it's not a traditional sports model where you have everything all in one place. It's this traveling model where guys live all over the country, and those of us on the medical side need to figure out how we're able to track and manage them, not just in the off season, but also in between the game weeks directly into our facilities in a particular city. So to me, getting more trackable data on the guys was a no-brainer. So we built a couple performance training programs and injury prevention programs for them over the last 2 years, and we feel like continuing to utilize what's out there as far as technology will only help improve that process for us.
That's interesting. You bring up kind of the barnstorming model of this league. I don't think most people think about is there some complications with tracking the medical health of all of the participants when they're not located in one singular place. Can you just kind of quickly take me through the genesis of that thought and then how you guys have navigated that here over the first couple of years of the league?
Yeah, I mean, like in any business, communication is key. And that's what we're always looking to improve. And the more data we have, the better. So, the genesis of it is really just bringing like-minded people together to make sure that we're all invested in what the athletes are doing, what their health is like, and then the communication piece behind that to ensure that everybody's operating on the same wavelength. At the end of the day, we're not just talking about a team of 20 or 22 guys. Really, with this league, where, when you're in a position like mine, as a head physical therapist, I'm really concentrating on 300 guys at one time. So we really need to, get our data situated so we know exactly what we're looking at, know how to progress the athletes appropriately, but then more importantly, report back to their coaches and their teammates to how they're doing and how they're going to perform in that next game.
Mike, was lacrosse a tech-forward sport, or is this kind of a new thing for the sport that maybe has been kind of shepherded by the PLL?
This is absolutely new. I don't think that in the former leagues they were thinking about some of this stuff. But as we continue to progress and, look at other leagues and the other models that, for example, like Will said, the EPL or the NFL have, we knew that this was the direction that we needed to go.
All right. So Will, tell me a little bit about lacrosse and just the idea of what you guys do to help athletes and obviously medical personnel optimize their performance. Is it different sport to sport? And if so, if you can kind of lend any idea of how this helps the lacrosse player?
Yeah. So, I think at the heart of what we're helping the PLL do is, it's very similar to what we do with other leagues. And really that's to focus on unleashing the potential of their athletes. And typically what we're trying to build is, actionable insights for coaches and players around performance, around health, around wellness. But obviously, once you start working with a league or a specific sport, you definitely want to customize those insights to help them optimize performance and reduce injury, and ideally prolong their ability to compete in high level. And so, what we're working with Mike and his team is really to, now sort of hone what we know around player load, around, injury prevention, around, high speed efforts, acceleration efforts, for example, and how is that impacting their athletes, in terms of lacrosse games. So you typically are doing, at the heart of it, the genesis is the same. Is how do you, help create actionable insights? But then you're starting to customize them for teams specifically.
I mean, this is an interesting marriage. You kind of opened this by saying, this was kind of player driven. They're accustomed to this type of training and this type of input, and now they want to see that move into these new leagues. And the PLL is one of the most modern leagues that is out in American sport right now. Can you kind of, Will, take us through like how that chasm has been bridged? Because we've talked to a lot of people where there's just kind of old school ways of dealing with data, and you're talking about a very new school way of it. And it does feel like on some level that it's been the younger generation that's kind of shepherding the change here.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the fantastic things about, I think, the PLL here is that, they are in many ways starting, fairly fresh, right? And so they don't have the baggage of sort of the antiquated ways of thinking about training and even the way they're thinking about, their schedule in terms of, not being in a single location all the time and kind of moving around. And so I think with that also comes sort of this acceptance of technology, right? That, technology is there to, really give insights in ways of how to improve performance, in ways of how to help your athletes, avoid injury, and even in, areas where, thinking, sort of long term about how do you, utilize some of this data to help, create, better fan engagement. So, I think it's actually, one of the things to us that was quite exciting about this partnership was that, they're looking at technology in a very sort of welcoming way. It's, you're not going in and saying, well, technology could help you. I think they're already thinking about how technology helps them every day. And they're looking at this as really to say, what's the best technology out there that I could, use for this particular purpose?
I'll go back to this specific collaboration in a moment, Will, but you did mention fan engagement. Are you kind of specifically talking about how this information could be used in the form of content and accentuation of the broadcast, or however they're disseminating the PLL?
I think think long term, it's always, I think, a conversation we have, particularly with leagues, is, how can you actually utilize some of this to educate the fans in terms of what's happening on the field, right? Whether you use that for perhaps giving insights of how hard an athlete is working, or how long they've run in a certain particular game, and maybe some of the difference in acceleration efforts, for example. I think those are all really interesting ways of thinking about data from a fan perspective. We tend to stay fairly agnostic as a company in terms of how this data is used for media specifically. I think our focus is always on helping the athletes and the trainers and the coaches make good decisions. And if in the process of doing that, a league could actually find a way of utilizing some of that data in a way that's not disparaging to the athlete or to the team. We actually think it's the right way of thinking about it.
How do you think about that, Mike? When you think about the data that you're collecting that's helping your athletes, accentuate their performance to whatever degree, how much that information would or should or could be disseminated to fans of the sport? How do you kind of view that?
Absolutely. I think we need to start with our goals for getting this product involved with the league from the beginning, which is really to identify what a professional lacrosse player looked like from a performance perspective. And without having trackable data, wearable devices on them, it's nearly impossible to do that. And so we started looking at, what each position looked like from a performance perspective on the field. And that has quickly turned into the athletes that these devices are on are highly interested in how they're performing during a game. And they're also interested in getting that information out there. And I think from a fan perspective, to be able to see, whether it be in real time or in replay, exactly how fast the player is moving, what their heart rate is, I think that just helps fan engagement and helps understanding how elite these are. I remember walking on the field for the first time to a PLL scrimmage in our first training camp at IMG Academy 2 years ago, and the first time I stepped on that field, I just said, "Wow, these guys are moving." It's a whole nother level than I think what a lot of people are used to, and I think the more and more the fans can engage with that, the more interesting the sport becomes.
Let me talk about load management since that came up. In other leagues, while the fans may not like it, the NBA has to put up with days that some of their star players are just not going to play, and other sports are kind of following suit. In a sport like the PLL, which is new, I can only imagine, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I have to imagine that everybody wants the stars to play as much as possible. So how do you kind of toggle between that idea of load management and nascency of a league where you are trying to put your best product out there as much as possible?
Yeah, and the rosters are thin. They don't really bring an excess amount of players to be able to just plug in there. So your stars are your stars, and you're expecting them to play. As soon as they come off the field or they're unable, say they get injured, it becomes extremely challenging for a team. So I think what we're looking to do is really ensure that their training protocols are appropriate so that they can stay in the game and really manage those games appropriately. We don't have any interest in necessarily managing their load in game. We're expecting that if they're there, that they can play and they can play at their highest potential.
Okay. What have you learned so far? Can you kind of share some of the data with us that this partnership has provided about your players?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing, and I think one of the more exciting things to learn about is how fast they're moving. So we have guys who are running at speeds of upwards of about 19.8 miles per hour. And that's in game. So that's moving. That's not just doing a straight sprint on a field. So, when you're talking about that, and then their ability to do that over, 5 yards at a time, you realize just how quickly they are accelerating and what it takes to move past their defenders. We're also learning that the midfielders and long stick midfielders in the game are covering the most distance, which might not be surprising to some people, understanding that they are, moving throughout both sides of the field. However, as lacrosse has specialized and we're seeing more offensive midfielders versus defensive midfielders, to understand that they're still carrying or covering that much distance is pretty impressive. And those distances at times, we had a player run 9,000 yards this past weekend. So you're talking getting close to that 5 mile mark of movement during a game. So these are all things that we're going to use throughout the process of the off season to tailor programs, to have our athletes understand what it truly takes to play in this league. Because at the end of the day, if you're not optimizing your performance, you're just not going to play at this level.
And so you're also telling me my 8-year-old lacrosse player should strive to be a midfielder if he wants the right contract too, is what you're telling me.
You got to be able to move. That's
Got
what
it.
I'm talking about.
Yeah. All right. I'll see if he wants to work as hard as you're suggesting he needs to work to get there. Hey, Will, tell me a little bit about, I assume that you all are constantly innovating based on feedback from leagues, teams, players, et cetera, for what they want. I'd love to just get kind of an overview of what you're hearing from leagues and athletes about the type of data that they'd like to know more about.
Yeah, so we typically have sports scientists that are collaborating with leagues in particular around a number of different aspects, both on sort of the data that they're looking for, but quite honestly, more importantly, is what are the insights can I get out of this data? I don't think we're hearing a huge request for enormous amount of new data. I think what we're hearing is actually, how can I get this data tailored very specifically to sometimes the position, the athlete type, and particularly what are we at Catapult seeing in terms of training regimens, as it relates to sort of different types of athletes. So, I think what Mike just said, I think kind of bodes well into kind of that comment, right? Is what you start to see is once you begin to collect data, you start to notice that there is some differences between positions, right? So you look at first you look at midfielders, and then you start to pay attention to, well, there are some different types of midfielders, and what do the defensive midfielders do in a game versus an offensive midfielder, and if so, how do I start to tailor training regimens for it? And so our sports scientists actually spend quite a bit of time with folks like Mike in not only in the PLL but other leagues, really helping kind of create that off-season, training, not only off-season but in between games training. So if you discover, for example, that high speed, distance is what you need to train your offensive midfielders to, what are the best ways of doing that? And then how do you actually measure that you're doing that on training days? And that I think we get quite a bit. I think the last time you and I spoke, I think the leagues were just kind of getting back to normal following a pandemic. And one of the big requests that came out of there was, I got a short training season. How do I deal with this? Right.
Yeah.
And in situations like, I think the PLL, I think their big questions is, and I think as Mike began this program, I got athletes that are, all over the place, right? So how do I ensure that their training is, suited for what their performance requirement is going to be in the field? And so we get that quite a bit.
Will, to your point, I think that plays out where, guys think that they're doing one thing, but when we actually track them and get the real life data, they realize that, they need to be moving a little faster. They need to be covering a little bit more distance in their training protocols, and putting that in front of their face really helps them to, I hesitate to say work harder, because I think that they're working, as hard as they can. I think it's just working smarter and ensuring that they're reaching those levels.
Mike, does that come down to just putting the information in front of them? Does that come down to different methodology of how you work one-on-one training them? How does all this data then get implemented?
Yeah, it's a combination of all of those things. I think sitting down with the individual athletes and making sure that they understand what the position demands, what they're capable of, and then identifying what they're actually doing are all the things that we're trying to piece together. And so once we get that data, the athlete is just more informed at that point. And I think we all know for all of our professions that the more informed we are, the better that we're going to be able to perform, just because we have that knowledge base to be able to go out there and get it. So these lacrosse players are no different than that. And they're hungry for the data. They want it. They want to compete. It's something that I've noticed as well over the season. They're asking me, am I the fastest guy in the game? Am I covering the most distance? What am I doing? So you're seeing that competitive nature also come out in them, which is, certainly a secondary thing that we weren't necessarily expecting, but one that's very real in the lives of these athletes.
You're like the personification of the Orange Theory board. They want to compete against each other. They want to know where they stand.
Yeah, maybe we should start flashing it up in the stadium.
Maybe you should.
Yeah, and I think to Mike's point, it's really about tailoring the programs to the athlete, to the position, and then at times to the sport. I think what we've discovered here at Catapult is that, the more, like I said, the more data they have, the more they start to realize, wait, I actually didn't know I was running this much high speed distance, or, I didn't know I was, switching directions as often as it's showing up. How do I get better at that? And what you realize is that, old training programs was a one size fits all for the entire team. And now what you start to learn is, how do I tailor to the position, and how do I tailor to the athlete?
I'm happy to give you a real life example of just that with an athlete that we're working with in the PLL. And he came to me and he said, Mike, I feel like my top speed's there. I'm flying around, I'm moving, I'm as good as ever, but I feel like when I'm getting to the end of the game, I'm feeling a little bit tired. So when we peeled back his training program, we looked at it and we look at, what his sprint distances look like. And using the data that we've been able to collect through Catapult, knowing that they're running, sometimes 8,500 yards in a game, and out of those 8,500 yards, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 of those yards are actually at speeds of greater than 12 miles an hour. I was able to tailor a program for that specific athlete that ensured that his sprint program were getting upwards of that amount of distance and that amount of speed over time. We did that in this most recent break where we had, a week off in the All-Star game, then another week off. So we had a good 3 weeks to really help that athlete catch back up, and he was able to get back into that next game and flying around and not feeling tired towards the end. So, I don't think that we would have necessarily been able to peel that back quite as much, as specific as we were, if we didn't have this data.
It's all really interesting. Will Lopes, CEO of Catapult, and Mike Giunta, the head physical therapist of the PLL. Thank you both for joining us.
Bram, thanks for having me.
It's great being here. Thanks, Bram.
On the next Future Sport podcast, Olympic disciplines don't have to disappear from the ethos for 4 years.
And as such, that gives the opportunity for a league like World One to come in and compositely take all these events, much like the Olympics has, and say, hey, let's see how we can monetize this via these individual athletes on social media. World One League, all of our sports are individual, and they're all under a minute long.
That's Brett Morris, CEO of the World One League, where athletes from around the globe are competing and being discovered thanks to sharing their athletic ability. That will do it for this episode. As always, the future is now. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein.